Well, good afternoon. My name is David Landsberg, and I'm a professor in the John Glenn School as well. And boy, this has been an interesting conference so far. Lots of new things I've learned, lots of issues for me to contemplate over the next couple of days, and there's still more to come. As I was listening to some of the panel discussions, it seemed as if our panel was really put in an opportune place because we're going to be talking about data governance. And governance, for at least me, is who has access to what information, what quality, under what circumstances. So whether it's healthcare information, the good privacy discussion that we just recently had, we can talk about principles, but in many cases, lots of these decisions about data governance are made day by day and form the constraints or the opportunities that dictate whether, in fact, we can use that information. So it's really the intersection of law, technology, policy, and culture. So I'm particularly excited because with all of our conference or our panelists for today, they've all agreed to come. And so hopefully we'll be able to wrap up or at least touch on some of these governance issues. Each of them have their own perspective. So let me briefly introduce the panelists. The first to my left is Brian Cameron, and Brian Cameron is the Executive Director of the Center for Enterprise Architecture at the Penn State University. He's also a Program Director for a new Master of Professional Studies in Enterprise Architecture. And then Brian actively consults with a wide variety of corporations and government bodies such as Accenture, Oracle, and the NSA. So we brought Brian in to make sure we have questions for today's panel. Next, we have Barbara Cohn, and she's the Chief Data Officer of New York State, and she also oversees New York State's widely acknowledged Open Data Initiative. Very interesting experiment. But prior to that, she worked with Mayor Michael Bloomberg in New York City with the HHS Connect program, which was very instrumental in sharing intergovernmental data that helped advance technologies to facilitate data exchange and optimize outcomes. And finally, all the way to my left is Dr. Ashit Talukder, and he manages the Information Access Division at NIST, where he leads a division of over 100 researchers and staff that work in the areas of, among other things, big data, information search and retrieval, and visualization. So I'm looking forward to this panel on data governance, and I think Brian will start with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's hard to follow such a distinguished group of speakers and panelists that we've had today, but I'll do my best, and especially at this time of the day. I'm Brian Cameron. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Enterprise Architecture at the Pennsylvania State University, and I'm going to bring a different dimension, somewhat different dimension to this big data discussion that we've been having throughout the day. When we talk about governance and decision making, I'm coming from the perspective of the different decisions and what needs to happen to make big data systems work in complex organizations. Okay, so I realize most of you are end users or consumers of these systems. But if you're involved in big data implementations, I want to give you some feel for some of the issues that large complex organizations have and why the skill set that we typically attribute to enterprise architecture, the enterprise-wide analysis, design, implementation skill sets, are crucial to organizations of all types and around the globe, and why these people are in such great demand today, hard to find. One of our earlier panelists talked about some of the data set skills that are hard to find. This is another one that's hard to find, but so crucial. So what I'd like to do is first tell you a little bit more about my college and myself and give you an idea of the perspective I'm coming from, then talk about what enterprise architecture is. Maybe it's a term you haven't heard before. If you have, I guarantee you probably have heard various definitions, et cetera, and talk about some international efforts we're involved with to advance this profession, and then tie it back to big data and governance as well. So I got a lot to do in 15 minutes, so I'll do my best. Our Enterprise Architecture Initiative started in 2009 in the midst of the global financial crisis, and I'll talk in a minute about why that was a good time. We have a new master's program, undergraduate program, new research center, the College of Information Sciences and Technology at Penn State. If you're not familiar with us, it's one of the I-schools, but the I-schools really span a wide range of capabilities. We're on the IT side of that range, so we were set up to be the middle ground, if you will, between business and hardcore technology disciplines like computer science, engineering, et cetera. We have an eclectic mix of faculty under one roof. We have policy people, we have attorneys, we have computer scientists, we have business people, psychologists, sociologists, and my academic colleagues can tell you there's it's not without its issues having that many different disciplines under one roof, but the benefits far outweigh any potential issues. So I'm going to go quickly over some of these slides in the interest of time. Within our center, we've got a very broad base of support in our membership from organizations in the public-private sector, 7 countries represented and counting. So we bring a good cross-industry, cross-country perspective to some of the topics that we're covering. So in addition to our center members, we're also involved in pulling together many of the professional organizations in this space. This is a relatively young, emerging discipline, and there's a lot of groups focus on data architecture, software architecture, business architecture, and other components of this larger piece, and we're trying to bring them all together to really advance the discipline and put more of one face rather than have all of these different fragmented efforts occurring across the globe. It's been very successful. If you go to fipo.org, you can read more about our efforts to bring this community together and professionalize the discipline. Okay, let's talk about some of the drivers. Why is this such a hot topic right now, and why are we getting so much interest in what we're doing at Penn State? As I mentioned, we started our efforts in the midst of the global financial crisis when organizations all over the globe were looking for ways to become more effective, more efficient, more agile, and that hasn't stopped. Many organizations, I think it's human nature, we don't try to become more efficient until we have to, and in most cases we have to today. So we're looking at enterprise architecture, and I'll explain what EA is in a second, but to help to drive a lot of these efficiencies, effectiveness, agility, and to really get the most out of our data and information resources. Michael Porter, those of you from business schools, I'm sure you've read quite a bit of Porter's work, estimates that 80% of organizations worldwide do not successfully implement their strategies. This is public and private. It's not because the strategy is bad in most cases, but because of a poor execution, failure to execute. And enterprise architecture, if it's structured appropriately, staffed appropriately, can be an effective bridge, and that missing bridge in most organizations, between strategy and policy decisions and their tactical execution, and that bridge that's missing or poorly functioning in many organizations. Again, I'm going to go through this quickly. An analogy that typically resonates with most people is the analogy of a city planner versus a building architect. Building architect, typically concerned with the construction of a single structure. That's analogous in many ways to a system architect. A system architect is concerned about the construction of a single system. The city planner, on the other hand, is a good analogy for the enterprise architect. City planner has to understand what the building architecture people do, but also needs to understand a whole host of other things that the building architect typically doesn't concern themselves with, zoning and infrastructure and other things. So that's really the enterprise architect and the enterprise architecture team. The people that are looking holistically across all of the silos of your organization and doing this enterprise-wide city planning. One of the big issues we see in big data with our constituents, big data is typically done well in the silo. But once you start going from silo to silo in large organization, typically it doesn't work so well. We don't have enough enterprise architecture, enterprise data architecture people that are really planning and implementing the right enterprise-wide infrastructure and plans and architectures to really allow cross-silo data consolidation, analysis, et cetera. I think that's the next big challenge that we see in many organizations. And this is an international problem. I'm leaving in 2 weeks for Taipei to do a three-day workshop on similar issues for the Industrial Technology Research Institute, a group of their senior architects. I've been doing work with the government of Kazakhstan and on and on and on. So this is global interest, global set of issues. Everybody wants a definition of enterprise architecture. There are many out there, and some conflict with one another. We actually just finished an international year-and-a-half-long effort to draw consensus on a good definition and perspective on EA, which we just published in Architecture and Governance magazine this past November. But most of the definitions essentially strive to understand the current state of the organization in 4 primary areas, which I'll talk about in a second, where we want to be in the future, what's our desired future state, and how we get there to better align various parts of our information technology, infrastructure, and architecture with the strategy of the organization. And again, there's a lot more to this, but I'm going to go through it quickly. These are the 4 traditional areas of analysis: the business architecture, data and information architecture, application architecture, and technology and infrastructure architecture. And none of these stand alone. You really can't talk about one very long without talking about the other. You really have to have a holistic end-to-end perspective and discussion. And then most EA methodologies and frameworks follow a similar process of helping you understand the current state in these areas in your organization, where you want to be in the future, and how aligned, or in most cases misaligned, your current state is with the strategy of the organization, and then what you need to do over typically a 3 to 5+ year period to get from current state to future state. So again, this is very much aligned with strategic planning. Some of the benefits, I'm not going to take the time to read through all of these benefits, but at a minimum, EA brings to large complex organizations a consistent way of thinking and talking about the enterprise. Any of you that work for large enterprises, you know there's different vocabularies that are used around the enterprise. And with the IT people, they have a vernacular of their own. This gives us a consistent way of at least starting some of these enterprise-wide conversations between a diverse group of constituents. Okay, let's get into big data now. Okay, big data, I think we can all agree in some circles it is a buzzword today. Anytime we're using somewhat of a large data set, we're going to put big data on it because that's the fashionable thing to do today. And I think a lot of the big data discussions and initiatives that we see are focused really on short-term objectives. We don't see a lot of long-term strategic planning around some of the big data initiatives, more around our current issues around getting our arms around a particular area's data or a particular data set. And there's not enough emphasis put in many organizations on developing this long-term strategic architecture and infrastructure, not just for our needs today, but for our seen needs and, more importantly, the unforeseen needs in the future. I'll talk more about this in a second. So let me just bring this build up quickly. So not only within our organization, but most organizations today, we're very interconnected. The term supply chain or value chain. So we need to be able to integrate and understand and do big data analytics on data sources with all of our partners as well across our supply chain. So you put that dimension into it yet, and this is an extremely complex, and honestly can't be done without the type of enterprise-wide, without the type of city planning. Whether you call it enterprise architecture or not, we can debate that, yeah. But the type of end-to-end enterprise-wide design, analysis, et cetera, that we typically attribute to this field, very tough to get big data going across, even between silos in a particular complex organization, let alone between all the different partners and others in the supply chain. So some of the trends. Many of these topics have already been talked about, so I'll go over them quickly. We've been talking about the velocity, the variety, and the complexity of data. I've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to go really fast now. And I don't think there's anything more to say here. I'm going to tie this up here at the end. I've mentioned about supply chain. So not only do we have more complex types of data and velocity of data is growing exponentially, then we start looking across all the different organizations that we deal with globally today. That number's growing immensely, and with the number of mergers and acquisitions and other things going on in the world, it becomes a very challenging environment for the infrastructure and architecture teams to get their arms around and understand. But without a good infrastructure, it's like a house. If you don't have a good foundation built on these things, we've heard a lot about garbage data, et cetera, but if you don't have a good infrastructure pulling the data together from all the different pockets and silos in an effective way, you're only as good as the data that's coming into your systems. So more and more organizations are starting to think about this enterprise-wide. I spoke a few months ago at a practitioner big data conference in San Francisco, and this was a big issue with many in the crowd. Forrester, Gartner, and other analyst firms talk about the role of enterprise architecture for designing enterprise-wide big data environments. Some of these major points to focus on are on the screen. I'm going to tie this up at the end since I'm running short on time. I'm going to hit a few other points first. So as I said, organizations are developing a holistic approach to information architecture, and this involves governance. So one of the main factors why enterprise architecture, enterprise-wide big data initiatives, or any enterprise-wide initiative for that matter, fails is poor governance, poor decision-making. So and how we're defining governance in this context are the structures and the people that populate those structures that make all the different decisions at different levels of the enterprise architecture process. So if you don't have the right structures in place, or you don't have the right people from the right levels populating those different structures, you're going to get poor decisions. And we see this over and over again from many organizations. And then bad decisions get compounded on bad decisions and leads to very poor infrastructures, or can lead to very poor information technology infrastructures. Also, added to this, we've heard a lot about this, the different types of data from social computing sources. One of the previous speakers talked about context-aware computing and other trends that are generating enormous amounts of data. And then we start generating these enormous amounts of data across all the different silos within the organization and across all of our different partners. And without the type of city planning that we're talking about with enterprise architecture, you can imagine what would happen in a city if you didn't have a city planner. I mean, look at some cities with poor city planning and no zoning and no planning of infrastructure. It becomes a mess quickly. And that's the state of more organizations today than we'd like to admit. This is a graphic from a book by Jeannie Ross and Peter Weil at MIT entitled Enterprise Architecture Strategy. And again, it illustrates the point that enterprise architecture can be an effective bridge and should be an effective bridge between the organization's strategy and the tactical execution of that strategy, which typically takes the form of projects and other initiatives. Okay, then to sum up, the role of enterprise architecture in all of this. One role, investigate. There's many different technologies coming out, almost every week in big data and every other area. So which of these technologies are right for our organization? Which are ready for prime time? Some are newer technologies, and maybe they're not where they need to be in their maturity curve for us. So who's doing this type of scanning analysis and figuring out when to adapt or adopt particular solutions for your organization? And many organizations it's done in pockets, maybe not enterprise-wide. That's a role for the enterprise architecture group, or potential role. Benefits and risks of technology. I've got a minute left. Communicating the business value of these solutions to the folks within the business side of the organization. Governance framework, we've talked about that, extremely important. Like as I said, number one reason why these type of initiatives fail is because of poor governance structures. And I've got plenty of examples of poor governance structures from the companies I've worked with. And then providing guidance for sustainable innovation. If you think about the enterprise architecture group and the unique vantage point that it could and should have in your organization, where it's looking across the organization and is in a position potentially to connect dots in a way that no other parts of the organization can connect. It can be a great hub and facilitator of innovation in your organization, again, if it's positioned and staffed appropriately. And I am out of time. Right on time. Perfect. Okay, all right.
Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm really so excited to be here. This is a really exciting, really important conference. What makes this conference so extraordinary, so significant, is that the topic, big data, impacts each and every one of us. It's because we're discovering together. We're attempting to understand and navigate the buzzwords of today and how they change or not change, or change somewhat, how we approach and understand data governance. Inasmuch as we are operating in an ever-evolving environment with a new byte, B-Y-T-E, by the way, being defined regularly, with more zeros than anyone could have ever imagined or anticipated way back when, not thousands of years ago, but just a few years back. We are engaged in a dialogue about where we think we're headed, as it has yet to be written. Or has it? Do we need to look back, to look inward, in order to advance forward? We have heard throughout the day about big data. As you can see, I have a lot of transitions because we're in a very evolving environment right now, so I didn't want to be static. So the transitions between slides not only keeps us focused, but also says a lot. It's more than just a nuance about where we are today. But we've heard throughout the day about big data, about the volume, about the velocity, the variety of data, about the unlimited potential for analysis, the futures, for data-driven understanding, the promise of data. I just flew in from Albany, New York, having celebrated the first anniversary of our open data portal, the New York State data.ny.gov. It's a global platform that's now been accessed by individuals in over 135 countries, 50 states, including the District of Columbia, 4,000 cities, including 3,000 United States cities. Similar to big data, open data is creating extraordinary opportunities to explore, search, utilize, analyze data in ways never before possible. That's the promise. It is indeed a data revolution. Big data, open data, actually just data. Data is moving so exceedingly fast and growing exponentially. It's being collected, ingested, extracted, pushed out at an incalculable rate. But at the same time, we should be experiencing the thought revolution. What do I mean by that? The world contains an unimaginably vast and increasing amount of information. However, in spite of this proliferation of information, a void exists. Albert Einstein noted, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. T.S. Eliot pondered, where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Saul Bellow, the writer, mused, information is to be found in daily papers. We are informed about everything. We know nothing. Now, Saul Bellow was talking about daily papers. Today, we're living in a 24/7 news cycle, actually faster than that. How many daily news feeds or daily feeds do the people in the audience here today receive? How many times has your smartphone vibrated today with an email or a text? How often do you give your full, undivided attention to a single task? For how long? How many times have you stood in front of a cashier holding your smartphone in the other hand? What has any of this have to do with data governance? The quotes of Einstein, T.S. Eliot, and Saul Bellow ask us to pause, to think, to analyze. The strength of our analytics rely upon accurate data. Don't take data for granted. Think, challenge, study, analyze. Apply intuition, judgment, observation. I'll come back to this later. But if we can't pause, if we won't pause, given the speed with which data is coming at us, we need to be ever more vigilant then in how data is governed. We are operating every day at warp speed, multitasking, communicating in only 140 characters. Why is data governance so important? When was the last time you navigated a trip using a real paper map from the AAA? How many of your contacts in your phone do you actually know the numbers by heart? What if you had to be disconnected for a full week? We are relying upon data more and more for everything we do. And think about it, as are the professionals we rely upon, our doctors, financial planners, banking institutions, car manufacturers, everyone. And with that reliance comes an expectation that the data we rely upon will be relevant, accurate, reliable, consistent, complete, of the highest quality. When you're using your navigation app, when you're driving, what's your expectation? It's that the data in it is accurate, and yet you'll actually get to your destination. Why data governance? To ensure that our expectations regarding the quality, utility, and promised value of data are met. It can help ensure reliable, consistent, and repeatable data. It can help facilitate turning raw data into actionable intelligence. It can enhance performance outcomes, generate new insights, foster innovation, accountability, data analytics, promote research, and advance interoperability. Data governance can facilitate maximizing the derivative value of data, social, economic, and scientific. Now, let me come back to where I began. I stated we're attempting to navigate the buzzwords of data today and how they change or not change or somewhat change how we approach and understand data governance. Well, what is data governance and how apropos it is that we're here sitting in the auditorium of the OSU University Moritz College of Law. In an essay written by Jeffrey Stone and William Marshall, professors at the University of Chicago and North Carolina, respectively, they noted, and I quote, and listen to these two passages really closely, that the framers of the Constitution were visionaries, that they designed our Constitution to endure. They sought not only to address the specific meaning, the specific challenges, by the way, facing the nation during their lifetimes, but to establish the foundational principles that would sustain and guide the new nation into an uncertain future. Think about those words. They go on to state, and I quote, the framers understood that they were entrusting to future generations the responsibility to draw upon their intelligence, judgment, experience, to give concrete meaning to these broad principles over time. That the principles enshrined in the Constitution do not change over time, but the application of those principles must evolve as society changes and as experience informs our understanding. Now let's carry the meaning of these words forward and apply them. The quadrants below highlight core elements of governance. Number one, first and foremost, and from my experiences, most important, leadership, unequivocally. A leader who is steadfast and resolute in their support for data governance. Further, the most effective data governance structure provides a solid foundation, a common denominator in a global society where the norm is constant change. Depending upon the organization, this may come in the form of bylaws, a charter, an executive order, statute, other. Data governance provides a framework. It provides a forum for decision, for resolution. It clearly defines the goals and strategies of an enterprise to help ensure a common, clear, and consistent approach. Remember, common, clear, consistent, reliable, all aspects of data governance. And this provides the guidance for the drafting of policies, standards, and procedures. It provides effective direction and oversight, especially where cultural norms are being re-engineered and transformed. At the same time, as noted by the framers of the Constitution, these basic principles must be agile enough to adapt and adopt to changing circumstances. Again, with the sheer volume and velocity and variety of data, I just put these up for fun just to make sure, it's the end of the day, to give you some sense of how much data is out there. Reliability is critical. Jules Berman, who authored The Principles of Big Data, suggests that there's 3 more V's. Vision, having a purpose and a plan. Verification, ensuring that the data conforms to a set of specifications. And validation, checking that its purpose is fulfilled. All of which, I would argue, are realized from governance. Quality data is an imperative which governance must support. Policies and standards provide the structure to bridge disparate data vocabularies, formats, values, sources, structures, size, complexity, and interpretation. Today's innovation involves technology strategies and leveraging bi-directional aspects of collaboration across an enterprise among subject matter experts, the business owners, the data owners, legal counsel, data analysts, policy strategists. The New York State Open Data Initiative is an excellent example of the implementation of how benefits can accrue from strong governance. All of the elements are present and active. It is a quality by design approach that seeks to maximize the public's understanding and utility of the data. A strong and committed leadership, structure, clearly defined goals and objectives, and detailed policies and standards, and agile to adapt to changing circumstances. The New York State Open Data Handbook provides details, policies, and procedures and guidelines regarding identification, review, and prioritization of publishable state data. Additional guidance focuses on standards for formatting and the requisite metadata, data dictionaries, documentation, so an end user, no matter if they're in Albany, if they're in Ohio, if they're in Europe, or further, will understand the data on its face without me having actually to sit with them. So we have to maximize the utility of the data so there's no misinterpretation and there's no misinformation. And it also improves data quality and begins the standardization to foster an extraordinarily important aspect of this, interoperability, the ability to share information across sectors, whether it's within an organization or outside. These very same principles are indispensable, even more so, when facilitating data sharing and data exchange. That is governance. Sharing data, exchanging data, within, between, outside organizations can be a very complex process. There's no formulaic answer as to whether or not it is appropriate to share information. Where there is explicit language, however, these interests must be respected, cannot be disregarded, and are variously protected under law. In all other circumstances, there needs to be regard to the relevance, necessity, and the benefit of exchanging information. Data governance ensures such critical questions will be answered. Strong governance can make possible what was thought to be impossible and intractable. No matter the speed, no matter the size, whether it's a bit, a gigabyte, a yottabyte, and beyond, data governance is indispensable to yield the greatest return from our most valued strategic asset. Implemented well, it will help minimize data challenges to yield data that is accurate, reliable, complete, and consistent. Such attributes are indispensable to maximizing data in order to take the next steps to discover, analyze, theorize, and apply. Driving this point home is Aristotle. It is known that Aristotle studied whales, dolphins, and porpoises. He took exhaustive notes, both of his observations and his methods. Jules Berman relates the story that Aristotle was one of the first experts in classification. His greatest insight came when he correctly identified dolphin as a mammal. We take this for granted. That said, that Aristotle was ridiculed and disregarded at the time because all others categorized the dolphin as a fish, basing their classifications on similarities, not relationships. It was only in the last several hundred years biologists have acknowledged Aristotle was correct. Why is this dialogue so very important? Data discovery is the future. Data analytics drives the data-driven economy. Data governance informs analytics. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is an unenviable position to be the last speaker of the day. I know all of you are tired, so I'll make sure you stay rooted to your seats the best I can, okay? So continuing the topic about governance, I want to make sure that governance, as we all agree upon, is not by dictation. It's rather done by consensus. It's done by a group of stakeholders coming together, agreeing on a process and a set of standards, and that's what we do at NIST. So what I'm going to do is I'll talk a bit about some of our ongoing activities in big data standards and performance measurements in big data. As you know, NIST is a standards organization. So one of the most famous things that we are famous for is the atomic clock, the most precise clock ever. And that's really the focus. Our focus is on the science. It's not on the policy. So what we do is we try to avoid the policy side by doing science and measurements that in turn informs the policies, okay? And in the big data space, that's really what we are doing right now. That's what we aim to do. We don't aim to touch the policy side, but rather we hope to use core measurement science and metrics and standards that'll help drive policy in the future, okay? So NIST itself is a 3,000-person organization. Just a quick overview for those of you who don't know NIST. The different labs at NIST, one is a physical measurements lab that designs the world famous, the most precise clock ever. And we have the materials measurements lab, and we have the information technology lab. So my division is part of the information technology lab. We are about 100 people strong, and the focus of the division is on the data to knowledge pathways. So when you have raw data, and you go from data to knowledge and data to information, what are the measurement science and the standards that come into play to make this data to discovery, data to knowledge much easier. That's really the focus of our research and mission. So the main big data activities that we are focusing on right now, one is we have an effort going on in big data standards. So we have a public working group that's focusing on designing standards for big data, making sure that there are reference frameworks and architectures that big data systems can adhere to or can map to. We also have working groups on data interoperability. So as we have heard about many, many times, there are a huge multitude of data sets out there, but many of them are not digestible by each other. So I, as a user, if I want to access a new data set, there are really no procedures in place to make different data sets interoperable. So how do you make data sets more interoperable? How do you make data sets more machine readable so that one machine can talk to another and ingest the data from another data source? So talking about data interoperability, which is touching upon some of what some of the panelists talked about. How do you create common reference APIs for big data systems? Okay, if you have big data systems that are developed by different vendors, can you have common reference APIs? Okay, so there's no one single solution to making big data systems more standardized and interoperable. So we're looking at different methodologies to make big data systems more reusable by each other, by the vendors and by the end users. The second one is we're trying to drive foundational advances in big data analytics itself. So one promise of big data is not really the fact that the data is there by itself, but how can you transform the data into knowledge? The earlier paradigm of scientific discovery was doing hypothesis during discovery. So you would have a scientist who had a hypothesis, and then based on some small volumes of data, the scientist would then figure out if the hypothesis was validated through the experimental data. That is one approach. But the promise of big data is that if you have the raw data, then you can do data-driven discovery without really developing hypothesis, and that'll open up the door for new discoveries that you really couldn't do just through hypothesis, okay? But analytics itself is much more complex because of this advent of big data. So how can we measure the performance of big data analytics systems and then identify foundational gaps in big data analytics and have a community of experts working it together? That's what we do as NIST. We always work with all the stakeholders. So in the big data science effort and initiative, our focus is on extending what we have done over the last 20 years. I'll just talk about that a bit through measurement science. And the last one, which is kind of in some ways touching on many of the topic areas for this conference, is privacy and big data. So we have a pilot program on privacy, R&D, which is again not to set policies themselves, but how can you derive risk assessments of privacy from the data? How do you do user-driven privacy metrics? Okay, so it's all about the measurement science. It's all about how do you methodically and objectively come up with assessments of risk of data and of the user interactions with the data so that the users and the policymakers can then use these risk assessments to come up with policy decisions about privacy, okay? So again, I want to make sure that we do the technology and the measurement science behind some of these work, but we impact the policy in these spaces indirectly. So I personally don't like the term big data too much. Big data is, I think, an overhyped term. What we see is that increasingly most of the data sets that the users deal with are unstructured in nature. Okay, you've seen reports, I'm sure, where 80% of data sets owned by enterprises are actually unstructured in nature. They can't be stored in relational databases, in traditional databases. So when you have unstructured data, the mechanisms to analyze the unstructured data becomes much more complex. The data to knowledge pathway becomes much more complex. So I would prefer transitioning from the word big data to more like complex data. Because I've heard of many cases with my colleagues from NIH where they say, we have only megabytes, tens of megabytes of data. It's not really big data in the traditional sense, but it's so complex. It's so unstructured, it's so difficult to get a hold of that even if it's 100 megabytes of data and we know that we can use a high-end supercomputer to actually put it into a system, we don't know how to analyze the data, okay? So big data is increasingly unstructured in nature. It's also, we are transitioning from data at rest to moving data, so streaming data coming in. So the challenges are not about these large volumes of data, not all the time anyway, where we have challenges with loading all the data into memory, but also how do you analyze the data in a quick, efficient manner when the data is streaming in. So that being said, analytic solutions also are getting more and more complex because the data types, the data modalities are more complex. So once the analytic solutions get more complex, how do you measure the performance of different analytic solutions? And these are largely unanswered questions. So, we have many academics and vendors who come and say, well, we have the best big data solution for you. And they say, well, I talk about a problem and they say, yeah, we'll solve it for you. But how do you assess whether vendor A's solution works better than vendor B's? Or if an academic comes to me and says, I have the best solution since sliced bread for data analytics, how do you assess that statement is true? How do you know that the analytic solution is really good? So things like, how do you measure the quality of the data? How do you translate the quality of the input raw data to decisions? Okay? How does uncertainty propagate through complex decision-making processes? And these are largely unanswered questions because in most analytic solutions, you have data going in, you have a result coming out, but you don't know what the uncertainties are. You don't know whether the uncertainties in the data have been magnified or diminished or not. And then lastly, the human in the loop. So measuring or assessing the performance of the human in the loop and making sure that big data analytic processes provide the information in the right way at the right time is very important. So being able to measure how the human is using the system and then using those measurements to actually enhance the performance of the end-to-end analytic workflow is very important because analytics in many cases are autonomous, but in very critical decision-making processes, you have the human in the loop. So you have to make sure that the information is presented in the right way at the right time, otherwise the human is not going to see it. And there have been many cases of critical disasters that could have been avoided if the information was present, but the user did not see it at the right time. So what we're doing is we are trying to create a measurement science around big data analytics to understand and measure how analytic solutions work. So just to give you a quick overview, and I know we're running out of time, in my division, we have been working on different aspects of analytics for quite a while, but we have been focusing on specific data modalities. So we have been running since 1992 the TREC Search and Retrieval Conferences, which has advanced the state of art in search and retrieval from text documents. And this started in 1992, where we created reference data sets. These were small, megabytes in size in 1992. And then we created some challenge problems to advance search and retrieval. At that time, and even now, we have Microsoft Research and other IBM that comes to these conferences. We create reference data sets. We create metrics. And then we have the community work on the same type of problems, and every year they come back and they discuss what worked and what didn't. And essentially what really helps is when the experts start talking about what did not work, okay? And that's how we identify the foundational gaps in a particular process, and then we create challenge problems to help overcome that gap, okay? So I have a group that works in search and retrieval, another group working on machine-generated data, another one working on video, speech technologies, and one on human-system interaction. So we covered all ends of the data modality space, but in big data, we see that there's a convergence of different data types. So now there's an increasing need where you need to mash up text with images, with other data, with machine-generated data to derive a better analytic process. So as a approach of what we do is we identify a specific problem, we design the metrics for it, and in the beginning, when it's a very new technology, we identify the initial barriers, and then all the stakeholders, all the experts come and they spend some time solving the initial barriers. And as these barriers are solved, we get the problems more interesting, we make it more challenging. So just some snapshots, we helped advance the state of art in speech recognition and machine translation. So we started off with very simple speech data captured in a lab, no noise, very controlled conversations. And as the researchers in the community drove down their error rates, in speech recognition technology, we made the challenge problems tougher. We went from data in the lab to broadcast speech, to telephonic speech, and then to pure natural speech in an open environment. So by going from more easier problems to more difficult problems, we helped the community drive down their error rates and increase the impact of the technologies, make the technologies much better. The same thing for search and retrieval. Here's a quick snapshot of the impact that we have had. Just a quick example. One example is that the Watson system that you hear about many times in the news nowadays, some of the Watson technology actually is credited to Trek evaluations, where creating the reference data sets helped IBM researchers advance some of the natural language processing technologies that's used in Watson. So in the data science program, where we had the kickoff in early March, we have the same vision, okay? But instead of focusing on a single data modality, what we are doing is we are expanding out to big data, to data science, where we have no bounds on the types of data that are used, but rather when you merge different data sets, can you advance the state of art in big data science by reference data sets, by creating metrics, and then getting together a large community of stakeholders who come from different domains. So in big data now, as you can see from this conference, we have stakeholders from medicine, we have stakeholders from law, we have people with all different kinds of expertise working in the space. And many times, what you find is that you have a solution in one domain that could be reused in other domains and therefore create some foundational advances. So in our data science program, that's our specific objective. We want to get experts that work in different domains, coming under the same umbrella, talking to each other, and then identifying solutions that work, identifying gaps that exist across different domains, and then having the community of experts work together to address those gaps. All right, so that's really the main crux of what we want to do. So we want to advance rigorous measurement techniques to measure data analytic solutions. We create reference frameworks that others can reuse. Then create reference data sets that creates a common platform and a common environment for others to test their algorithms. And then challenge problems where a community of stakeholders come together to perform and test their algorithms. And this is really about community collaboration. What we do is all open research. Our conferences are open, our data sets are open, anyone can download it from any country. And we believe in the performance of the masses. We don't believe that the best solution exists in a single organization. We believe that if experts can work together, that's how we can foster true advances in technology. So this way, we want to help all the stakeholders understand the state of the art, and then essentially what this will allow is it'll allow the end users to understand what the current state of art is. It'll allow the vendors, the technology solutions providers, and the academic solutions providers who are developing foundational research tools to understand where the gaps are, and then also be able to test out their solutions on the common data sets, and then talk to each other. So the end objective is that by having different stakeholders work together, we reduce the transition of technology, we identify foundational gaps, and then make sure that we go forward in not incremental steps, but in many cases, we create fundamental advances in data science. So I'll end there. I know I'm out of time. As I said, we had the first data science conference where we had about 350 people come from across academia, federal agencies, and next year we want to hold common evaluations. So if any of you are interested in hosting some sessions, or if you have data sets and challenge problems that you want to co-own, or if you have some particularly prickly problems in data science that you think can be solved by a big community of stakeholders, then please come talk to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I want to congratulate our panelists for being very disciplined and ending exactly on time, which leaves us time for questions. So if you have any questions, I think we have some mics up front here. But I guess maybe in the meantime, while people are getting their questions ready, for us people who have been thinking about data islands of information, silos of information, the importance of interoperability, data sharing, and maybe even enterprise architecture and standards, sometimes it feels like we've been crying in the wilderness, the importance of data governance. And I'm now wondering, with big data, which is partly a technical component, right? We've developed new technologies that now allow us to process information better, but in some ways it also represents the socio side of that. We now recognize the central importance of data in decision making, and data is now sexy. Wow, the time has come, and I'm just wondering if this new understanding of the importance of data has somehow affected the standard setting process, the willingness to set up standards, the enterprise, whether our existing mechanisms to resolve and make these rules about how we use information, whether this new interest in data is going to turn things around in terms of us being able to do this better, or whether it will put some new kinds of pressures on our ability to do these kinds of things.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so I think this prevalence of data is both a boon and a curse, right? So the fact that we have open source solutions for big data, and the big data technology space is very different from evolution of previous technologies, right? So earlier in other technologies, you would have vendor-specific closed solutions, whereas now in big data, you have the focus is on open source solutions, and that makes everyone empowered to be a data scientist. And therefore, we have actually a stronger willingness for people to come to the table and discuss how data sets can be made more interoperable. So I think in most cases, it's a boon. Now, the fact that we have such a prevalence of data, and the fact that many of these data sets can be mashed up together, and then you extract some PII information which does not exist in the individual piece of information, is a curse. And we need to be cognizant of the drawbacks and the hurdles as we go forward with the standard setting process. That's my take on it. I don't know about your perspectives.
No, I totally agree. I think that it's making, I think it's becoming, the fact that it is becoming widespread and sexy, and that people understand it better and they understand what the promise of it is that it's moving that needle definitely forward, because it's almost as though you're crowdsourcing. And people are pounding on your door. We want to get better decisions. We know the technology's out there. We know it might take a while, especially because of the standardization and the different formats, et cetera. But we want you to move forward, because prior to this, you couldn't. It was paper-driven, and it was hard to get, let's say, from a human service perspective, in a holistic view of a client. Now it's much easier. So I think that's a real driving force. And I think from the privacy and security, we shouldn't be talking about the privacy. It's really the security protections, because they are there, and role-based access, especially in the private sector. But I think it's a boon and a curse, but I think it's positive overall, because the train has left, as someone said before. We're not going back. We're committed to moving forward. It's a matter of now, from the governance perspective, how do we move forward judiciously and not arbitrarily or capriciously?
I couldn't agree more. On the boon and the curse theme to the discussion, to your point about open source, I do a lot of work with EMC, the largest global storage technology and software company in the world. And they're moving their business model to professional services, because things are going, it's open standards and open source. So they don't see the hardware and software as the future of their business. They see it in professional services. So I think that speaks volumes. But what I'm also hearing from people in the field, and this gets back to the practitioner conference I did a few months ago, is that we have all these tools, everybody wants a dashboard, et cetera, and you can put something up relatively fast today. But there's a lack of understanding by many on what it takes to get a really good infrastructure in place so that you're getting the right data and good data, et cetera. So there's almost, in some communities, inflated expectations that we can turn this stuff on quickly and have good analytics and data as a result. And that's the frustration I hear from people that are actually putting the infrastructures in place, that there's not a lack of understanding and funding to do the enterprise-wide solutions as well as they'd like. So that's a consideration.
Good. Thank you. Questions, sir?
Well, I don't want this to be one of those questions that's just all about me and my problems, but I'm going to use me as an example because it's the only part of this that I know. I'm in the business now of trying to promote wider access to better forms of legal data. And the government is the big customer and supporter, and actually, to the degree that anybody's doing this, it's government agencies. And so now I'm starting to sort of watch and see how they're trying to fund these things. And generally, they're funding them through end-of-the-year money, afterthought kind of things, to somebody who's already on an IDIQ, and one group does this one and one group does that one. And if they do put out a sort of serious RFP, it's got a small business set aside, it's got to go somewhere here. So that, all that I've sort of heard in general terms about how the procurement process makes any kind of systematic, rational building of things that fit together impossible seems to be, that's what I'm experiencing. So I guess my questions are twofold. One is, what are you guys trying to do about that? Do you sort of have a plan that we could try and be part of, I guess? And then secondly, do you have any sort of advice for practical strategies for people who are producing data and would like to have it kind of fit this much more rational model, but don't really see how that's allowed?
Yeah, so do you want to take a shot at it? Should I?
Well, maybe not from your perspective, but just to echo that theme. Again, back to the practitioner conference, the one big issue around doing the enterprise-wide planning is who pays for it, because we're all budgeted in these silos. And until that question gets resolved and we start doing cross-silo funding, you're going to have the same issues, because at the end of the day, I talked to a few that tried to do this, they got the support, but then when it came down to where the money's coming from, and at the end of the day, that's the killer in all of this. That's when it started unraveling. So that's the funding issue is one of the first things we need to address, and I think it's going to take some enlightened leadership. There's politics, as you know, behind funding. There's a whole raft of issues to unpack there. So that's.
I agree.
I don't know that I have any solutions right now.
Yeah. I mean,
I mean, the only thing I would say is that's one aspect of it, but that shouldn't preclude the beginning of interoperability. That shouldn't preclude creating standardization, whether it be through the Dublin Core, et cetera. You can mandate that, or you can strongly encourage that. That doesn't preclude agencies whose maybe councils have been risk averse because there's uncertainty to actually come to the table, speak with each other, at least get those either MOUs or universal agreements together where you might be able to have one-offs. So funding's an issue, but it certainly should not stop moving forward in terms of the promise, knowing that hopefully as you move forward, there will be funding down the road, because otherwise you are going to be in paralysis, and we shouldn't be just because of that.
Could I just throw in one additional thought? I don't want to make it sound like it's all doom and gloom. There are a few organizations, precious few, that actually have enterprise architecture on the investment board for the organization. So no project, et cetera, is funded unless it fits into the overall enterprise architectural plan, and the funding in these few organizations is distributed across the silos. It has happened, but not nearly as often as we'd like to see, but I've seen a few good examples.
There's also one other thing, is that we should be leveraging what we also have internally. Oftentimes you may not necessarily know the inventory, especially if it's a very large enterprise. So there might actually be pockets where things are already happening, and you can actually leverage that technology without building a new hole. So there are areas where, again, you could still move forward.
So to echo that, besides the open data initiatives that's occurring in the state governments and the federal governments, there's also an initiative called the Scientific Data. So there's a Science Data Committee at each federal agency, and the focus of each agency's SDC committees are how do they make the scientific data from their agency, and even the data as a result of funding from their agency, available to the general public. So that hits a bit upon the data interoperability, in the sense that making these data sets and the results of the funded grants, let's say, available to the general public is not a trivial problem. But the hope is that in a year or so, there'll be an initial data set from each, or sets of data from each agency available. And NIH is doing a lot of work on this. NIST we have a SDC, and we hope to make the DOC data more available. In fact, DOC, if you sat or if you heard Secretary Pritzker's strategic plan, there was actually a strategic plan for data. And there is mention of making data from DSC interoperable and available to the public. So data is a big thing now. The other thing I'll mention before I stop on this question is DARPA has a big data program called the X-Data program. And we have the best of the best data analytic R&D researchers working as performers on this program. One of the outputs from this program is that all the tools developed under X-Data will actually be available on a repository to anyone. So in theory, you'll have the best, the next generation analytic tools available. So on the one side, we see this push for making data more and more accessible to the public. And then we have the tools that have been created through federal grants and contracts now being available to the public. It'll take some time, but it's going to happen.
I think you're next.
Yes, this is a very interesting conference. Thank you to all the organizers. Anyway, I have a question mainly directed to the NIST person, but the other people can also address it. I'm a chemist by profession, so I'm not sure if there wasn't anybody in the panel. But anyway, I'm specifically in biochemistry and toxicology, so it's not quite the topic that you are doing today or maybe tomorrow. But newborn screening is mandatory in all the states in the United States. And with mass spectrometry, we generate huge amount of data daily with birth rates, especially in states like New York and California and maybe Texas also. So that's a huge data. But even with different mass spectrometers, different types, because we have the standards and controls, we are able to get very valid data. We can validate our data. I was just in California attending the artificial intelligence conference that my son was presenting. And they had this open session, and I asked one of the presenters, what kind of, how do you know, because there are no controls and standards. Like my professor in sociology says, why aren't you good little atoms? When you are in a crowd, everybody acts differently. So the NIST person, what kind of metrics or how do you make sure that the data that they have gotten from the crowdsourcing, they call it, is valid?
Right. Well, that is an open problem. And we have, similar to your question, we had a lot of attendees from NIH at the data science conference that we had last 2 weeks ago. And there were similar questions brought up. So there were questions from the NIH side about how do you, when you do experiments, especially medical-based experiments, biological experiments, how do you make sure that the experimental protocol is characterized properly in the data set, in the metadata, and then how can that be reused to cross-validate with other experiments at other sites? So it is an open question. We have had discussions about how to create standards and ontologies. So this touches more on the semantic web in the ontology space. So how do you create common ontologies so that different experiments can be sort of compared to each other? Because experimentalists use one phrase in one institution and another phrase in another institution. So ontology is just one of that, one challenge, right? The other one is what are the noise characteristics during the experimental observation process? In some cases, you're using bad sensors, so your noise is worse. In some cases, your sensor is really good and your noise characteristics are much better. So they're all open questions, but we are working with NIH on some of these issues and standards. But it's not a solved problem. Any other comments?
Yes, sir.
So there's an old saying in psychology that there's nothing so practical as a good theory. And I've always felt that exploratory data analysis, even with big data, is most useful when it's part of a larger program of research aimed at testing and applying theory. I'm wondering if you guys have any suggestions for how to develop an architecture and governance plan that fits the needs of the entire program of research.
Well, so for the data science program that we just started, our goal is to have a reference framework that others can either use if they don't have the resources, or they can take back and replicate in their own organization for a host of problems. Obviously, it's impossible to have a silver bullet that addresses every problem, but the idea is to try to solve and address a variety of problems by using this reference framework. And we are working on implementing this where at the infrastructure layer, we have a choice of different infrastructure solutions that one can use. Multi-node architectures versus multi-core architectures versus clusters of nodes versus GPUs, right? And then at the middleware, you can use different software stacks or middleware stacks, and then you have the application layer. So we are trying to build this plug-and-play framework and then implement it internally, a very small prototype of it that can be reused. So if there is interest on your part, we'll be happy to include you in the discussions.
A suggestion I might offer, if you think of a large research initiative as an enterprise, there are enterprise architecture methodologies and frameworks that could be applied and adapted to that enterprise. Now, most organizations don't use any of the popular methodologies from start to finish. They develop a hybrid approach that works for their organization. So if that's of interest, I'd look at some of the popular ways of performing enterprise architecture and creating a hybrid approach that can be applied to your large research initiative, and think of that as the enterprise.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Sure. Let's propose a new agency. That's all we need. The National Data Agency, where every data collecting source in the country has to send copies of everything they have to that agency, with the exception of home computer systems where you have your personal contacts, so that there's one agency or one entity that has literally all the data there is, but guidelines and protections. Well, what's wrong with that?
Well, so can I answer that? So we have NARA that actually has that charter. So NARA is given the charter to actually archive all relevant data, and they face a challenge because they don't have the resources, the budget to actually do that. So they're working with all the different agencies to see if DOIs or some RDF-based framework can be used where the links and the repository of where the data resides across different federal agencies exists at NARA, but then the data is hosted at the individual agencies themselves.
Yeah, well, just speculation.
Yes.
Cost benefit. Let's put everything into a big data in the sky, or whatever you want to call it, and then shut down all of the governmental agencies that have data collection sources, and save all the money from the shutdown of those agencies to fund the big computer in the sky.
Well, here's I posit an answer. When we were doing HHS in New York City, moving things just for the sake of moving things isn't a necessity. We had a federated solution. Key information where we had to do probabilistic and deterministic matching for clients. It was once somebody put that information in, once they logged off the computer, it went into ether, and it disappeared. But you still need the experts. I mean, you need absolutely the data owners. You need the expertise. To move for the sake of moving, most people are not even building huge data warehouses anymore. It's a failed project. It doesn't work. So you need to always have that human, that thought, the think, the challenge. You need those experts in the field, and they're not going to be in one single agency.
Yeah, but idealistically, we're talking about getting rid of the hardware. You can still have your experts within the particular agency, but rather than trying to get data from banks and insurance companies and everything else, go to one single source, and you got everything there, subject to guidelines, et cetera. It seems like a perfect solution. Politically, it will never work because I can't conceive of the FBI giving up their computer database and putting it on some open source.
Right.
Well, and I think what he's talking about is maybe the extreme shared services model, where there's just one provider of shared services for all the government. Right. And you are seeing shared services being adopted throughout the federal and state governments, and even down to the local governments, out of economic necessity. Not nearly to the degree you're describing. Will we ever see that? I don't know. Maybe not.
We already have,
not in my lifetime.
we have data.gov, right? I mean,
Yeah,
the
but-
data
yeah,
that
that
goes
is-
But it's different. Remember, you have ingestion, you have collection, you have maintenance, you have cleansing. I mean, there's a lot of aspects to data. That's why it's such a complex area. It's not that easy. It's not that even easy getting the information onto data.gov. It takes a lot of work,
Right.
not from, single practitioners, from a single agency, but from the experts in the field.
But
Shouldn't efforts be made to simplify the system to get that sort of data very quickly and without much cost onto a shared data system?
I think the way that's going about is very in a methodical way to ensure that from the sensitivity, the PII, and to ensure that it's quality data. There could be a lot of bad data out there. You don't want to move quickly just for the sake, short of stating what that ultimate benefit is in terms of grouping everyone in one place.
what I think is you have more sharing of applications, and you're going to get more sharing of data as well over time.
So some services have gone to the cloud. I mean, you're talking about the mega cloud, right? Everything is stored in a single cloud. So email, many agencies have transitioned their emails to the cloud.
More the commodity services.
Right.
Yeah.
But however, there's certain data sets where networking bandwidth come into play. So, some of the data sets are constantly being reused by the staff at that agency. So if you don't have the fat pipeline bandwidth, you're not going to be able to.
Well, yeah,
costs
well,
money.
and that's what's driving a lot of this. The budget situations that many governments face at all levels, it's driving this consolidation. So in many ways, I tell people the economic crisis has been good for enterprise architecture. Organizations don't try to consolidate and become more efficient until they have to. So the economic crisis and the ripples we're seeing in government, for my particular area, it's given it new emphasis and importance. So, we'll see if that continues.
Mine isn't necessarily a quick question, but I'll ask it anyway. Could you give me an idea of kind of layers? You mentioned ontologies. I'm trying to get a grasp of what data is already easily governed or is already within a sphere of governance that we don't need to worry about. What's kind of low-hanging fruit? We'll manage this in a reasonable time. And what's kind of outside the realm of, like, we can't imagine how we're ever going to get a hold on this data out here. Can you just give an example of that and how you would think about that kind of problem?
So there's certain data sets that are much more tractable and usable. Data.gov has its data in a more reusable, machine-readable format. And then each of the states have their own open data initiatives. So the census data, so all of that is the open federal data, which does not have any sensitive information, is increasingly being put on data.gov. And it's going through many redesigns. I think right now they're actually going through another redesign to make it even more reusable. So that's one example. NIH has a lot of its medical, de-identified medical data available to researchers. And I would say outside of data.gov, they probably have the biggest collection of data. So there are examples, and I'm sure you can come up with others.
The easiest one that's governed is the one that's governed by statute, which is an absolute bar. So, so you have to set that one aside because it has clear, concise guidelines. Once you start moving from that, it's for what purpose? And then it's not black and white. It's really what's the intended purpose, what's the intended use, who's the intended recipients, et cetera. So there are a lot of questions that follow, and I think that absent the context, it's hard. Then there's information that's strictly public, that's out there already, it's on the websites, et cetera. But there's a lot of in between. That's where's an absolute bar and where's actually on the free market.
Well, I think we're at the end of the hour here. Let's thank our panelists. Peter, do you have an announcement?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you. I want to say, by now your heads are probably bursting with a full day of ideas. And so we'd like to do the only honorable thing and buy you a drink. And so we do have a reception. It's in what's called the Barrister Club, which is a facility around the corner. So if you go out the 12th Avenue side of the building, make a right, go over to High Street, make another right, go down to 11th, make another right, and as soon as you pass Panera, you'll see a door on your left. That's the Barrister Club. Go upstairs. There's drinks. There's food.